special Thanksgiving Day era broadcast. We're going to talk about some stuff directly related to the history of Thanksgiving, the first one specifically, and what we can learn about it as Christians. Our guest, Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie. Tell us a little bit about our esteemed guest, my man.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to abbreviate it to take the whole show.
You do.
But we're pleased to have on Tracy McKenzie, PhD, professor of history, department chair at Wheaton College since 2010. Yeah, he's married to his best friend of 30 years, it says, Robin. They have 3 adult children. He has 2 favorite books, the Brothers Kaczmarov and Peace Like a River. He has a PhD from Vanderbilt University. Prior to coming to Wheaton, he taught, I think, for 20-some years, 22 years at the University of Washington there. And for most of his professional career, his research is focused on the effects of the American Civil War on the economy and society of the Upper South. Goes through several books that he's written, and but most recently, he's turned his attention to the ways in which American evangelicals have remembered their national heritage. Toward that end, he has recently written a book on memory of the first Thanksgiving, which I think is the particular topic that we're going to be discussing right now. Thank you, Dr. McKenzie, for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Well, Dr. McKenzie, we'd like to just begin with maybe some generalities or some general questions related to history. When we think about history, how would you answer this question? What is a Christian view of history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would start with the idea that God has created us to live as historical beings. And what I mean by that is that we all live in historical contexts, and we are shaped by those contexts. I think as a Christian, I believe that God is the Lord of history, that He's sovereignly sort of superintending its unfolding, that there is a sense in which history is a kind of revelation from God, that there are numerous benefits to Christian discipleship when we take history seriously, including the way in which it allows us to draw wisdom from the past, the way in which it allows us to see our present more clearly, and hopefully walk in it more faithfully. So I think there are just any number of reasons why, from a Christian perspective, it's just super important that we take the past seriously.
So would you say that history is a gift to the present? Okay.
You might say it. Yeah, it exists for the present. I mean, we don't study the past for its own sake. We study it because we believe that it illuminates today.
Acts 17:26, Paul speaking to the Athenians says, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him." Do you say that is part of where you would get your understanding of a Christian view of the history, especially the idea of having determined allotted periods of where they live? Meaning like
well, I mean,
this.
I think I'm sorry?
Meaning like, I'm glad I lived in the area, the era that God sovereignly determined that we don't have to wear short basketball shorts anymore. You know, that I get to wear longer ones to go about my knees. And the reason why is because I was looking at some of my old pictures, and I don't think the era had completely come in yet. And I saw a 6th grade picture of my basketball team, and they were still a little too short, little John Stockton-ish. But I'm glad that's changed. Is that an example?
Well, it's not the first example that I would have thought of, I guess. But I think that passage from Acts, Paul is reminding us what I mentioned before, that God is sovereignly overseeing all things that are coming to pass. And there is a sense in which, as people who want to be historically minded, part of what we're called to do, I think, is to situate our particular moment in history into a broader and broader story, to let our personal stories and our immediate stories become enfolded into this broader master narrative that God is unfolding.
Good.
Dr. McKenzie, what then got you interested to spend some significant time and write a book on Thanksgiving?
on Thanksgiving. Well, actually, it's not because I was all that in love with the holiday. I mean, I certainly have positive connotations with it, but I didn't write a book about Thanksgiving primarily because I was interested in Thanksgiving, which might sound a little counterintuitive. What I was really interested in and have been interested in for many years now is I really wanted to be and want to continue to be in conversation with Christians who are in some way interested in our nation's past, believe that it's important in some way. And I want to be able to talk with them and think out loud with them about the intersection between our faith, our identity as followers of Jesus, and our identity as citizens of this country. And I actually think that as American Christians work through that issue of how my religious identity and my national identity are related, there's all kinds of pitfalls, sort of traps that we can fall into if we're not careful. And I actually became attracted to the history of Thanksgiving because I thought that it was a familiar story that most of us have some sense of that provides a context for thinking through that relationship. I mean, Thanksgiving is a holiday that we think of as having some religious significance. We also think of it as dating to a key chapter in the foundation of our country, and just remembering how we remember the holiday, believe it or not, is a wonderful way to sort of think about how our identities can become confused, if that makes sense. I actually also think that Pilgrims are a wonderful example to us in some respects in their ability to keep a clear sense of their identity as followers of Jesus first and foremost.
All right, good answer. So what can we learn from the first Thanksgiving? And I'm especially curious, maybe even tackle this first. What's some of the truth? What's some of the myth? And why does it matter?
Well, there's lots of ways in which that story, the first Thanksgiving, has been embellished over the years. And a lot of the ways we remember it aren't very accurate. And to be honest, I try to make this clear in my book. I don't think that's the most important thing for us to grapple with, those minor details. For example, we probably don't have it right when it comes to what we imagine the Pilgrims eating or the setting in which they were gathering. They probably weren't eating turkey, for example. They weren't sitting in a big, long table out in an open clearing and so on. But I'm not sure that those details are particularly important. When I think about the things that we need to get right, I think, to me, it starts with the reason that the Pilgrims were in New England in the first place. In other words, what is it that brought them to North America, and what was the significance that they attached to what they were doing? And I do think that we don't get that right more often than not. If I ask someone just on a street corner or someone sitting next to me at church, why did the Pilgrims come to America? I think the most common answer is probably going to be they came to the Americas in search of religious liberty. And the reality is that's just not the case at all. They leave England in the early 1600s because they are experiencing some persecution, but they don't go to the future United States. It's a detail that sometimes we lose sight of. They actually go to Holland, and they spend about 12 years. Spend 12 years in a city not too far from Amsterdam called Leiden. And in Leiden, according to the Pilgrim writers, they have all kinds of religious liberty, and they actually believe that there are respects in which their congregation is flourishing, but they're concerned about some aspects of life there. They don't have much good options for making a living. They're concerned about the influence of Dutch culture on their families and particularly on their children. They're losing their sense of identity as being English. And for these and other reasons, they ultimately decide that their congregation is not going to flourish if they stay there indefinitely. And so they ultimately decide to relocate to North America, but not to find a religious liberty because they're actually writing in glowing terms of the religious liberty that they already have. So I think that's important, and I think it's relevant to us today, because when we talk about the Pilgrims as these individuals that were fleeing religious persecution, we probably are going to admire that, I suppose, but I'm not sure that we're going to relate to it in any very tangible sense, at least not for those of us who have lived most of our lives in the privileged and protected West. It's just difficult for us to relate to. But if we hear that the Pilgrims they were concerned about, raising families in a culture that they saw as detrimental to faithfulness, if we hear that they were concerned about basic things, how to keep bread on the table, how to make ends meet, all of a sudden, they sort of become more flesh and blood figures, individuals that we could imagine that we would meet at any moment that we could truly relate to. And so their story is actually much more normal in that sense than we often make it. And yet I'm still very much struck by their willingness to endanger their lives, to go to just enormous lengths to try to find an environment in which they believed that their families and their church would flourish.
All right, good stuff.
Now, another thing you bring out, and I think another aspect of just looking back at our past, is how we tend to idolize our past and maybe scrub out some of the more uncomfortable parts of people that we want to idolize, parts of their history. And so you talk about how not long after that first Thanksgiving, there was a conflict, right, between the Pilgrims and the local Indians. At one point, the English placed a severed head of one Native American on a pike outside their fort, which is a very nice thing to do. So this is sort of, in many ways, some of the ways we look back at Thanksgiving might be more revisionist than anything else. Why do you think it's important for us for those kind of stories to be told? Because I do think we tend to be today. I'm not sure what's the word I'm looking for. We don't like to look back at the past with those kind of clear eyes. Why do you recount that in your book? Why do you think it's important for us to be aware of these kind of things?
Yeah, I think the whole idea that we will sometimes make idols of the past, I think, is very important. I mean, when it comes to wanting to know what it means to learn from history and to remember the past Christianly or faithfully, this temptation to idolatry is a kind of pitfall that we really have to be alert to. Calvin wrote, centuries ago that the mind is an idol factory, meaning that our default mode is to create idols, and I think that's true in terms of thinking about the past as it's true in other ways in our lives. And so I think when we sort of try to engage figures from the past, warts and all, when we try to be honest about their limitations and their flaws, we are, first of all, treating them honestly. We're treating them as flesh and blood human beings. We're also, the way I put it in the book, is we're leaving much greater room for God's glory and God's being strong in their weakness. One of the interesting things about the Pilgrims specifically is that about 2.5 centuries after the Pilgrims came to America, the people of Massachusetts created what is today called the National Monument to the Forefathers, which is an 8-story high, 300-ton granite monument to the Pilgrims. And I see that as so symptomatic of the way that we can treat figures from the past if we're not careful. Let's say we sort of turn them into monuments, into marble statues that we see as really sort of superhuman, above reproach. One of the great ironies of all this with regard to the Pilgrims is that they go out of their way in their lives to attack any kind of worldview that elevates individuals to those positions of infallibility. If you read Governor William Bradford's history of the Pilgrim colony, he is underscoring the infighting that takes place, the various kinds of moral lapses that he sees them struggling with. And he says he does that explicitly so that their children and their children's children would be more drawn to the grace of God, would see the ways in which he had worked through their weaknesses rather than their strengths to bring about blessing. And as I put it, William Bradford wouldn't have been a very popular Thanksgiving Day speaker because he tends to call attention to the weaknesses and the flaws of the Pilgrims far more than to other attributes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
the Pilgrims might have been iconoclastic in a sense, for those who want to look at a slightly off word usage, but it's a fun word to say. But they were kind of iconoclast in that way. But then this is my, yes, you're the expert, but my reading is that Bradford seems to be pointing out in various writings places where he detects or sees God's providence at work in their midst, despite all the stuff going on. That's what it seems like. They do place a heavy emphasis on God's providence, his guiding sovereign hand in their midst, not necessarily their virtue.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. One of the most common phrases in his History of Plymouth Plantation is the phrase, in so many words, "So it pleased God," or "It pleased God that." It's a notation you just find perpetually, and I think it's interesting in that he's constantly sort of saying, "This is the will of God. This is what God was unfolding." What he's not doing, which I think is also instructive to us as Christians, is that he's not trying to read God's mind. He's not saying as he's writing that God has this special plan for the Pilgrim colony or God has this special plan for America. In fact, he will say from time to time, we must not presume.
Hmm.
But what he is saying is whatever God's plan is, we know that God is at work. We know when we are blessed that this is part of God's grace to us. We know that when we are encountering trials or ordeals, this is from God's hand. For what reason, I'm not sure. We need to try to figure out if we have incurred God's judgment. But whatever the case, we know it is from God.
Good. Now, on your blog, you talk a lot about this as well. I mean, I encourage people to get the book. You have a whole book on this. This is why, we're interviewing around this time of the year, of course. For those who want to find out, the book is called The First Thanksgiving, What the Real Story Tells Us About Loving God and Learning from History. But what kind of things do you talk about on your blog as well, Dr. McKenzie?
Well, the blog is about the intersection of Christian faith and American history. And I write for anyone who is interested in America's past but wants to be able to think wisely about it and Christianly about it. And I try to strike a balance between pointing toward those examples in the past, those episodes in the past that are very edifying, that we can emulate freely, in those areas where we have, fallen into pitfalls. The things that we need to learn from is cautionary tales, and I think both are very, very important. I'm just convinced that for any Christian, a serious engagement with the past is something that we are called to. It's an expression of the biblical injunction to honor age. I think an attention to history starts with a humility, which says we need a broader perspective than we can bring to the table ourselves to live our lives wisely. So a Christian perspective means we want to give weight to the past, but because we know that our hearts are fallen, that we have all kinds of inclinations to self-righteousness, to self-aggrandizement, and so forth, we also need to learn how to study the past wisely without ultimately either forging idols in the past or just using the past for ammunition. Frankly, an awful lot of Christians who have gotten involved in debates about history, I think, have wanted to score points in debates more than anything else. And so they've been searching for various kinds of, I call it ammunition, to use against the sort of position that they're attacking.
Some of our main information about this Thanksgiving my understanding is from a letter written a couple months later by Edward Winslow. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that one of the main
That is
sources?
correct.
And then it looks like we also have a section from Bradford where he looks back at 1621 and looks like he does mention Turkey in it, that one, but it's written sometime later. Are those our two main sources?
There's really only one source that specifically refers to what we remember as the first Thanksgiving, and that is this letter that you alluded to already, that a pilgrim named Edward Winslow, who is one of the younger adult male members of the colony, writes back to England a few months after the event. And in the context of a much longer letter, he devotes 5 sentences to a description of the celebration. I count them up and stress it in the book. It's a total of 115 words. That's all that we have that is specifically about that event.
Would it be all right if I
Bradford-
read? Oh, go ahead. Finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Bradford doesn't actually say anything other than God bless them with a bountiful harvest. And that's really all that he has to say.
Our corn, this is from Wenzel's letter, did prove well, and God be praised, we had a good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good, but our peas not worth the gathering, for we feared they were too late sown. They came up very well and blossomed, but the sun parched them in the blossom. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling. It sounds like a Christmas song. 4 men on fowling. Sorry. That's so we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They, 4 in one day, killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms. That doesn't mean arm wrestling. I think that means shooting competitions. Yep. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. Good day. I don't know how to. So that, I mean, that's the main primary source we've got then.
That's it.
I wonder if you could speak to then maybe what you might like to see if you could sort of influence a local church, local churches. I mean, how might churches give their people a better sense of history, help them to engage more in that area and just be more historically aware?
This is your last question, so you got to make it good.
Okay, make it good. That's a wonderful question, and I have thought about that a little bit, and I don't know that I have a great answer. I do wish that in our churches we would be reminded just how central history is to our faith. I mean, it sort of starts there. One Christian historian has said that Christians are, by definition, historians. And the reason why that is true is because at the heart of our faith are assertions about real-time historical events that we believe have very particular religious significance. So we start there, and then we move on to the idea that God is the author of history. He is superintending the story. God also, if you want to think about it, became a part of the story, right? He penetrated the story, took on human flesh, and became sort of a member of the cast of characters, if you wish, of the story. So I think it sort of starts there. Secondly, I would just say that I think there's a lot of reason to believe that as cultures move away from the sorts of religious and moral foundations that they once adhered to, at the heart of that is often a kind of almost intentional forgetting of the past. And I think we want to be alert to that, and we want to fight back against it where that is called for and is appropriate.
Good answer. You succeeded. Dr. McKenzie, I wish we could talk to you longer. Maybe we should make this an annual tradition, Pastor Bob?
Yeah, you got a Thanksgiving tradition.
What do you think?
I wonder if that was mentioned in the first letter there.
Probably not. But we appreciate your time. And again, we encourage people to check out the blog, which is, what's the best way to find the blog, Dr. McKenzie?
So if you Google Faith and American History, I think mine would probably be the first site that you were taken to. The URL is Faith in American History, all one word, at wordpress.com.
And people can find you, your interview with Albert Mohler, as well as some reviews on Christianity Today and the Gospel Coalition. So good stuff. Thank you for joining us, and happy Thanksgiving.
Hey, thanks so much. Bless you both.
Thank you.
That's today's show.